Hello, welcome to On Wildlife. I'm your host, Alex Ray. On this podcast, we bring the wild to you. We take you on a journey into the life of a different animal every month, and I guarantee you're going to come out of here knowing more about your favorite animal than you did before. In this episode, we're going to focus on one of the most crucial animals in our society today. We've discussed them on previous episodes, but today, we're specifically looking at the ones that we've domesticated. Our special guest today, Jennie Durant, is a writer and researcher who has spent over 10 years researching the role that these animals have in the environment and in our agriculture industry. So try not to get stung as we dive into the world of domesticated bees. Hi, Jennie. Thanks so much for coming on to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Alex.
Of course. I can't wait to start talking with you about bees. Can you tell me a little bit about what inspired you to become a bee researcher?
Yeah, so I'm a social scientist, and so it means I study the people who work with bees, but I spend a lot of time just understanding bees as well. And so my start in the bee world was kind of unusual. I was living in the Philippines and I was a Fulbright scholar. And so I was studying rice terraces in the Philippines up in the northern mainland of Luzon. And I was really homesick, and my friend, who was this Peace Corps volunteer, had left the region. And one of my friends had given me A Secret Life of Bees by Sue Monk Kidd. Something about the descriptions of beekeeping really spoke to me, and I was like, I need to go find a beekeeper that's going to help me with my homesickness, which is not a normal inclination for me. So I sought out this woman who had a resort down. I say a resort, it's not what you're thinking. It was maybe 6 buildings, and it was this really sweet little location in this island called Bohol. And she had designed the buildings they were hexagonally shaped and to be the cell of a bee. And the kitchen had all honey was woven into all the food recipes. And then she had bees on the site. And then she also taught beekeeping to farmers across the island. And so I went and kind of did a little internship with her and for 10 days. And this was in 2007. And that was when colony collapse disorder first was hitting the news in a major way. And so I'm falling in love with these bees, and then finding out that there's this mystery disease that's killing them. We didn't know what it was at the time. So what was happening was beekeepers were opening their colonies, and most of the bees were gone. And it's just very unusual behavior. And so scientists could not figure out what was going on. They were is it cell phones? Is it pesticides? Is it some kind of, pest? And we still don't fully know what caused those losses at the time. But all I knew was, to me, I was so intrigued, and I really wanted to figure out what was driving bee losses. And then eventually I decided to start a PhD program at UC Berkeley. And that's where I kind of really started diving into trying to understand bee losses through this lens of being a social scientist. So what are the economic, social drivers, behind bee losses? What's this bigger system that honeybees are operating in and beekeepers are operating in? And how might that be a driver to bee losses? So that was kind of how I got my start.
That's really interesting. And I'm sure some of that information is going to be in your upcoming book that's coming out on May 26th called Bitter Honey. Can you give us a little bit of a synopsis of that?
Yeah, sure. So Bitter Honey, the subtitle is Big Ag's Threat to Bees and the Fight to Save Them. And that really captures what the book's about. It really looks at how industrial agriculture threatens our bees, and puts a lot of pressure on them in particular. and puts a lot of pressure on beekeepers in turn. So I look at some of the practices within our farm system, like monoculture, agriculture, pesticide practices, and how those are harmful to bees. And then I also look at how beekeepers have industrialized the production of bees over the last like 20 to 30 years to be able to pollinate our agricultural system on like a really large scale. So looking at like trucking bees cross country, or pest management, or breeding techniques, feeding supplements, how do these things, this kind of stepping up of bee production, how is that making bees more vulnerable as well? But it's also a very hopeful book, I feel. And the book is full of stories about beekeepers. So it's very narrative. And I spent a lot of time kind of traveling all over the US, visiting them and going to North Dakota, interviewing policymakers in DC, going all over California. And then at the end, the last third of the book is really about that fight to save them. And so it talks about these three different chapters with different things like, farming practices, adopting large scale forage plots, which is like big, swaths of bee flowers, and then things we can do at home to help bees as well. So that's kind of the general gist of the book.
That sounds great. And I can't wait to touch on a little bit of that later on in the episode. And bees are such an interesting animal because they're so interwoven in our society, our economics, our way of life without us even knowing it. So it's got to be such an interesting topic to be researching all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's been taking up way too much of my time. It's like all I've been thinking about since 2007, but especially since 2012. So definitely still find it interesting, and I'm excited to keep exploring, and I'm always learning more.
That's great. And can you walk us through the story of how bees were domesticated in the United States?
Yeah, it's kind of cool. I think a lot of people might think that honeybees are from the US, but actually they were brought here by the European colonists. The first recorded shipment was in 1622, which from Europe to Virginia. And colonists were really reliant on bees back then. I think it's hard for us in this world of like sugar being available to imagine what it was like to have very few sources of sweeteners back then. And so honey was one of the key sweeteners that the colonists used for their food. They would also make mead, which is like a fermented honey drink, an alcoholic drink. And they would use, the wax for candles. And so they were this really helpful backyard, livestock that they had. And as we started moving west, homesteaders, would take these upside down baskets called skeps, and they would store bees in those, or they would have them in logs. But the problem was, to harvest honey, you would often have to kill the colony, because you'd kind of get in there and you'd pull the wax comb out, and the bees, the colony often wouldn't survive that process. And so beekeepers were always trying to figure out, I don't know if we've even still domesticated them, but we've partly domesticated them. And the big thing was, how can we create a hive where we can pull the frames out of the colony so that we can harvest honey from it, and we can also inspect it and see are these bees sick? How are they doing? And so I think it was around 1852, I'm always terrible with dates, Lorenzo Langstroth created the Langstroth hive, and that was the first movable frame hive. And basically, if you can just imagine a white box with 8 to 10 frames in it, and you can pull the frames out and look at them. And what he found out was making it so difficult was that bees need to have a certain amount of space that he calls bee space in between the frames. If it's too wide, they'll put in wax, so they'll build wax in there. And if it's too narrow, they just won't use that space because they can't travel up between the frames. And so he found just that right amount of space, and he called it bee space. And that was how he then made his hives, his colony design. And it's basically the same boxes that we use now. They're very much the same as they were back in the 1850s. And so what was cool about it was, all of a sudden you can inspect the hives. You could see if your hives, your colonies were getting too big. You could split them, and you could move them around, and you could create these much larger apiaries than beekeepers had ever been able to do before. And so it made beekeeping into more of a real operation and ability, something you could kind of make a living off of. And that really set the stage for what came later, which was beekeepers becoming commercial honey producers. They were producing honey during World War II and wax. They were really, really central to the war efforts. And then eventually they also became commercial pollinators, pollinating our crops, helping grow alfalfa seeds that we're feeding our cattle, and helping with pollinate apples. And so that Langstroth colony and a few other inventions that have helped beekeepers really set the stage for that kind of domestication and sort of making it into a commercially viable operation.
That's just amazing. I never thought that there was so much that went into beekeeping. And that kind of brings me into my next question. I'd love to know if there's a misconception that people who don't work in the beekeeping industry have about bees.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of people think that beekeeping is this kind of idyllic practice, and you're in your backyard and you've got your bee suit on and the bees are like softly humming, and you get a colony of bees and they make you honey and there aren't really any issues. I had that same misconception when I first started out. I got some bees 2 or 3 times and they all died, and very quickly. So I think the thing that would surprise most people is how industrial beekeeping is. It's these large, the beekeepers that are pollinating our crops and producing most of our honey are operating at these massive scales. And so some beekeepers have 1,000, some beekeepers, one operation has like 90,000 colonies. That it's a family operation, and they're managing this herd of colonies, across the United States. And it's really kind of a feast or famine endeavor, right? So like in California, we have the almond industry. It blooms in the middle of February and it's there for about a month. And then as soon as it ends, beekeepers have to find a new location, to take their bees to. So they've got billions of mouths to feed and they have to load them up, sometimes 400 to 500 on a semi truck. And then they're trucking them off to the next either pollination contract or the next place where they're going to be producing honey. And it's this huge operation with a ton of labor, and they're having to check for mites and pests and diseases. And it's a lot of hard work. And it just requires intense logistics, that I think a lot of us wouldn't associate with beekeeping, but that is really sort of what it is at this commercial scale.
Yeah, that's crazy. So it's not like having a little garden in your backyard. There's so much upkeep that's involved in it.
Even with hobby beekeeping, which is like having a colony in your backyard, it still is a lot of work. And I think a lot of people don't understand just again, like I said, how much they're going to have to manage for pests and really monitor their bees and put effort and time into understanding how it works to keep bees. They're not like an easy pet to have.
It's so interesting to learn about the ins and outs of the beekeeping industry. Let's take a quick break. And when we get back, we'll take an even deeper dive. You're going to want to hear about the bee refrigerators in North Dakota. On today's episode, I want to give a shout out to Noelle from Washington. One of her favorite animals is a binturong. These mammals are closely related to civets and fossas. Did you know that they mark their territories using scent glands and that they smell like popcorn? The popcorn smell is because of a chemical in their urine that's also produced when popcorn is popped. If you want a shout out or you want to support our show, you should join our Patreon at patreon.com/onwildlife. Okay, now back to the episode. I remember you talking about a little bit about your time in North Dakota, and I would love to know about these bee refrigerators in North Dakota.
Yeah, this was so surprising for me. The first time I saw one, I went to North Dakota to visit a beekeeper who I talk about in the book. His name is John Miller, and a few other beekeepers as well. he took me to go see this overwintering warehouse, and basically what these refrigerators are used for is to overwinter bees so that they're in kind of a safe place when it's, and imagine North Dakota, there's a ton of snow, it's super cold, and this is a way to keep all the colonies in one place. You can control the temperature, you can inspect them in this like really nice safe place. But yeah, so imagine like a giant airplane hangar, and it's like this huge, huge warehouse, or like an empty IKEA or something. And you can, pull in a giant semi truck, and there's tens of thousands of colonies on either side. A lot of them have red lights along the top of the ceiling, and that's because, and then they can shine them down because bees aren't bothered by red light. And so if you have normal lights on, it can stress them out or wake them up, kind of pull them out of their winter cluster, which is kind of like hibernation for bees. And so these red lights are how the beekeepers will work on the colonies. And then they'll use a big old forklift and lift them up and put them onto the semi trucks, before they ship them off to almonds. And they can control the CO2 levels, they can control the temperature, the amount of fresh air that's getting blown in. And they tend to build them out of California because it's just, they're so huge, and land is so expensive here in California that you'll often see them in like North Dakota or Idaho, Montana might be a great location where you can just pull in cool air from the outside to cool off the bees. So they're kind of just these like wild giant spaces, but there's a lot of science showing that bees who go into these refrigerators actually do really well. They tend to have lower mite counts, that pest I was mentioning earlier, and they tend to have their bodies just tend to be kind of healthier coming out of and more robust coming out of the warehouses. So it's just something about that stable temperature and bringing them in the fall, so they don't have to be searching for food too late into the fall. It just tends to produce a stronger, healthier bee for almond pollination.
That is so interesting, and something that I think a lot of our viewers might not know is just how big of an industrial endeavor beekeeping is. It's something that I never really thought about. So that it's just crazy what goes into keeping these bees healthy and alive, and all around really crazy.
Yeah.
And
I'm here to blow your mind, Alex.
You were talking about the mites that are kind of impacting bee populations. What are some of the main factors that go into that, and some other problems that bees are facing right now?
I think that when colony collapse disorder was happening, we were really looking for like a silver bullet, and there just hasn't been a single driver of bee declines. And so I really talk about it as industrial agriculture being a major driver, but we could break it down even a bit more. And so beekeepers talk about the 4 Ps. And so they talk about pests. And so the first pest that is the most problematic are these varroa mites that I mentioned. And it's kind of like, well, it's sort of like a tick, that's on a bee. But the way I like to think about it is if you imagine a giant crab that is attached to your torso and just sort of sucking on your liver slowly over time. And that's what's happening. Exactly. But it's evocative of why these bees are so sick, because they have these like ticks that just feed on them for a long period of time. And it's feeding on their fat body, which kind of functions like a liver, and in terms of detoxifying them. And then they're also spreading diseases. And so the second P is pathogens. And one of the big ones is what's called deformed wing virus. And that is a virus that's spread through by mites. And then you also have this what's called foul brood, which is there's like a European version, an American version, and those can just wipe out entire colonies. And then the third one is pesticides, which probably most people are going to be the most familiar with. And it's definitely an issue. But the nice thing about pesticides is beekeepers can often negotiate with the farmers or landowners whose land they're on. Like, hey, could you apply this at a certain time of day? Or could you hold off on doing that till I can get my bees out of here? And so there's a little more wiggle room for negotiating how pesticides might affect you. You can't control your bees. Sometimes they fly way off the property that you're on searching for food, but there is some leeway there. And there is a lot of, a lot of pesticides have labels on them that indicate whether they're at least acutely bee toxic. But there are some that are sublethally toxic, like neonicotinoids, which people might have heard of, which means that they can make bees sick in subtler ways, like they can affect their navigation abilities or their ability to learn or their ability to kind of to reproduce. And so these are things that kind of make a colony sick rather than kill them outright. And those are kind of the big concerns for the beekeeping industry, is these sublethally toxic pesticides. The fourth P is prairie, and I would just describe it as bee-friendly flowers. And that's a huge issue that we're dealing with. It's just there's just not enough flowers, for all the bees we have, honeybees and the native bees. And so that's an issue. And then I'd also mention, climate change is also an issue. And then also policies, like there are government policies, federal, state, local policies that can also really make it difficult for beekeepers and bees to be healthy. The world that they're navigating, that beekeepers and bees are navigating, and they all kind of intersect, in this nexus of challenges to make bee life a little more difficult.
Yeah, definitely. And I would assume that climate change probably increases the likelihood of these diseases and the mites that feed on the bees as well.
Yeah, it's really a force multiplier, right? And then the other issue that we have is like you've got drought, and then you don't have flowers, right? Because they dry up too quickly. Maybe they're dried up before the beekeeper, even arrives. And so like it was a couple of years ago, there was such a bad drought in the Midwest, which is where I think it's like 40% of all US colonies go to produce honey each summer to this particular region in the Midwest. And the drought was so bad that beekeepers couldn't make any honey. And then all of a sudden they were like, do I feed my bees? Do I find some new place down south where there's been some rainfall and take them there? And then wildfire is, wiping out bee forage, especially like on public lands where, which really affects native bees. And so it's really a shifting landscape for bees and beekeepers right now. And climate change really exacerbates, exactly as you said, like how all of these mites and so on are impacting bees.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like a lot of us take honey for granted because we can walk into the grocery store at any time and pick out our selection of all the different honey brands. But the amount of work and effort that goes into that is just unfathomable.
So much. And another piece I would just encourage, or I would mention is that, a lot of the honey is not from the United States. Beekeepers, I can't remember exactly what the percentage is, but they're producing something like a quarter or a fifth of the honey that's for sale. And some honey's actually the third most adulterated food in the world. And so some of the honey we're getting off the shelves isn't even just honey. It's sometimes honey mixed with other syrups or depending on where you're getting it from. So I would just always encourage people to, try and make sure your honey sourced from the US or from a local beekeeper. That then you really know that you're getting, a quality product. But yes, we still take it for granted, even then. And it's so true. Like just understanding all the work that goes into making honey it's a massive undertaking.
Yeah, definitely. And aside from the honey, what are some other reasons why people should really care about these declining bee populations?
It's funny because bees are like these invisible laborers in our food system, and they are pollinating a third of every bite we eat. It's like 35% of our total crop volume benefits from pollination services. And I think it's something like 75% of our top crops. So we really depend on them. Not every crop needs bees. Almonds need bees, for example, but some benefit from bee pollination and just, other animal pollination. But what happens then is we lose pollinators is harvests become smaller, and sometimes even just the crop themselves are smaller, fruits are smaller. And that means that if the harvest is smaller, then there's less of that on the market and the prices become more expensive. And so, bees are pollinating some of our most nutritious foods. Like, we're getting like vitamin C, vitamin A, vitamin E from the foods that bees are pollinating. And so it can lead to, nutritional deficiencies for people who can't afford those fresh fruits and vegetables. One study I read kind of blew my mind. It was estimating that insufficient pollination leads to about 500,000 deaths each year because of the nutritional, effects of not having enough, not having adequate nutrition
Wow.
because there's insufficient pollination around the world. And so, this really does have major effects. Maybe not here in the U.S., but who knows how long that will last. And so I really try and help people understand that even if it's not affecting you, it's affecting food equity for somebody somewhere to not have our pollinators. So we need to do everything we can to try and support them.
So, what are some of the actions that beekeepers are taking to support bees?
Yeah. So, I mean, kind of everything they're doing is to support bees. Like that's all they think about is like, how can I keep my bees alive? But two of the cool things that really come to mind is they've been just really initiating pretty amazing relationships with farmers. One of the cool partnerships I like to talk about or that has really impressed me, is their partnership with the almond industry. And so back in 2014, a bunch of beekeepers got together with some growers and sort of representatives in the industry, and they came up with a set of bee best management practices, or bee BMPs. And a lot of that was, how can we communicate about pesticide practices and maybe shift pesticide practices so that bees are healthier during bloom. And that's had some real success. I'm working with some colleagues right now to study, like, have we seen a measurable decline in certain fungicides which are bee toxic as a result? And our initial results are saying yes, that these BBMPs have resulted in actual fewer fungicides being used during bloom. And the other piece, besides like pesticides, has been a real increase in the adoption of like cover crops and hedgerows. And so, if you can just imagine, rows in an orchard. So in this case, almonds, and then so you've got your trees on either side, and in the middle there's a strip, and that's where you would typically drive like your shaker that's going to shake the trees so the almonds fall off, or your sprayer to spray agrochemicals. But in the middle, especially during bloom, some farmers are growing cover crops. And so you'll see these beautiful stands with mustard and daikon radish with like yellow and white flowers. And they help provide additional food and a more diverse diet for bees while they're in the almond orchard. And so one of the people I talk about in the book is this woman, Christine Gemperly, and she has this incredible farm. And it was featured I think it was on Green Planet, because it just like looks so cool and inspiring. And so farms can really become places that nourish life, not just producing a single crop, but they are helping. These cover crops can help feed the soil. They can retain more water. They can attract beneficial pests. And, a lot of this is coming out of this relationship between beekeepers and farmers, and this close reliance that they have. And farmers are like, well, how can I help? How can I help keep your bees healthy while they're here? And maybe even attract, some beneficial pests and other, native pollinators when the bees are gone, the managed honeybees are gone. So that's been something that's been really exciting for me to see.
That's great. And there's a big problem with those monocultures where you're only growing one type of crop. It's not only bad for the bees, it can be bad for the soil, for when you're trying to grow plants for the next year. So it's helping not only the bees, but everybody.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's. I mean, it really underscores that our farmers are land stewards, and the last thing I would just say about that is they also need support. So anything that we can do to, there's some great programs. Like one of them is called Project Apis M, and they have helped fund like the first 3 years of cover crop adoption for farmers, and so that helps them kind of just get a little financial incentive and support to get going with some of these practices, because there's risks involved in adopting any new practice. So that's also one way that, beekeepers and we can also support farmers is figuring out programs that are helping get these kinds of programs off the ground, and supporting those.
Yeah, that's great. And can you list some of the other ways that the average person can help bees?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so I don't know if you've ever read Michael Pollan's In Defense of Food, but he has this little saying, which you may have heard, which is eat food, not too much, mostly plants. This is like his advice on how to eat well, you know? So I really always loved that he had this like little pithy statement. And so I came up with one of my own that's not nearly as good, but just sort of like three things that I try and encourage people, you know, to think about how we can help bees. And so mine is plant flowers, limit pesticides, and share the land. And so, to talk about each of them a little bit, the biggest thing, if anyone takes anything away from here, is we just need more flowers. Like bees are hungry. We need to give them food. I typically say, don't get a honeybee colony. Like it is so much work. It is really hard. There are already so many sort of mouths to feed right now. If you really want to help, planting flowers is the way to go. And so you can, there are guides you can look at, like there's a couple websites. One of them is Xerces Society, which is Xerces. And they have a lot of information about how to get native plants in your backyard. Pollinator Partnership is another amazing organization that has similar information. You can talk to your native plant gardens. I always encourage native plants, partly because they can provide food for the native bees in your area, and then also they tend to just be more robust to like climate change, sort of climate variability. So like droughts or winters, those plants have evolved over time to thrive in those areas. And then in terms of limiting pesticides, and that one's kind of obvious, like pesticides we often overapply them. We can also buy plants from nurseries that are really cautious with, or just don't use pesticides at all. So that we're putting really clean plants, onto our properties, just being really mindful and thoughtful and using them as judiciously as possible. And then the last thing in terms of sharing the land, that's a bit of a mindset change. And that's something that really hit me as I was working on this book. I was really impacted by a few people I talked to in the kind of solution section of the book. And it was really like, how do we think of the land that we're on, not just as it belonging to us and sort of here for us to use and enjoy, but as land that is shared, by so much wildlife and by insects and animals in the soil and mammals that we're not seeing kind of, crossing in and out of our yards at night. And it may sound a bit corny, but I really think that developing sort of a sharing the land, sort of ethos can help us, be more conscientious about how we're using the landscapes we're in, how we interact with them, the respect we give to the other, creatures that share the planet with us. I think that will go a long way towards helping our bee populations and the other animals that rely on them to thrive.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think there's something so rewarding about making, let's say, your backyard a wildlife friendly backyard, and then you get to reap the rewards of seeing these animals thriving in your own backyard, and you get to share that with them. So I think that's amazing.
Yeah, we a quick note on that. We bought this property here in Berkeley, and it's like this very small house, and then it has this big yard in the back, and it was just grass and dirt. And we were like, okay, we really should fix up our house, but let's just make this yard really amazing. And so we planted this like central area that's just pollinator plants, and we never touch it. And I mean, we plant new plants in as they die, but like we don't use it for anything. And it's so cool. And we'll just like sit on the chairs in the backyard and we just watch the bees and the butterflies flow through and the hummingbirds. And it's like this little botanical garden in the back, now that we have all this wildlife coming through. And it's just been really inspiring. And so I'm a big fan of like lawn removal and even just a portion of it to try and plant some food for bees. So if people are into science or are already kind of checking out the things in their backyard or in their neighborhood, that's they can take photos and kind of help with data collection on a national scale, which is so helpful for the researchers trying to figure out how to support our pollinators.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's a perfect way to end the interview, because leaving it on a positive note, how we can help, I think that's awesome. So Jennie, thank you so much again for coming on to the show. Really enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. And I love what you're doing here on this podcast, and just so happy to be a part of it.
Well, thank you. There's no doubt that bees are extremely important for so many foods and products that we enjoy and really take for granted. I had such a great time talking with Jennie, and I'm so glad I was able to hear her insights into the bee industry. She's doing such amazing work spreading the word about how crucial bees are to our society and some of the problems that they're facing today. You should go check out her new book, Bitter Honey. And if you want to support some organizations that are working to help bees, you should also take a look at the Bee Conservancy, pollinator.org, and New York Bee Sanctuary. Thank you so much for coming on this adventure with me as we explored the world of domesticated bees. You can find the sources that we use for this podcast and links to organizations that we reference at onwildlife.org. You could also email us with any questions, and you can follow us on Instagram at @on_wildlife or on TikTok at @onwildlife. And don't forget to tune in next month for another awesome episode. And that's On Wildlife.